Good day. Before I proceed with this program, just a reminder that if you are watching any of our videos on local or on Rumble, that's to say the Duran, Alexander Mercouris or Alex Christoforou videos, you can go to the top of the video where you will find a red maroon button. If you press that button, that will take you directly to our locals homepage where you can join our locals community. And if you choose to become an active member, you can publish exclusive content as part of our locals community and join me in my Wednesday live streams. Well, yet again today, I'm afraid I'm going to have to talk about the Ukraine crisis. I call it the Ukraine crisis, though the Russians, in recent comments, especially by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, have said that, in fact, it's a misconception to see this as a crisis centered on Ukraine. In reality, it is a crisis of Russian-Western relations, which have been deteriorating steadily for roughly 20 years, and which have now reached the point of extreme crisis and possible no return. And Lavrov is, of course, right. But, of course, the epicenter of this crisis is Ukraine. And that's what I'm going to discuss today, or at least the responses to this crisis in Ukraine. Now, I'm going to briefly, before dealing with the substance of this video, touch on the events that took place in Brussels and in Europe over the course of last week. Now, in the run-up to President Biden's visit to Europe over the course of last week and the back-to-back meetings of the G7, the European Council and NATO, all of which took place in Brussels, and of course President Biden's trip to Poland. In the run-up to this trip, we were given clear indications that dramatic things were coming, that there would be major announcements, a strong denunciation of China and of China's stance over this conflict, and an unrolling of all kinds of sanctions against Russia, including an energy embargo. Now, I have to say that none of this happened. In fact, it was all a complete damp squib as far as I could see. Clearly, hardliners from Britain, the Baltic states, Poland, and I suspect the United States as well, came with an agenda to push this confrontation with Russia even further. But they came up against a brick wall in the form of strong opposition from the EU's Carolinian core, from France, Germany, Italy, and all sorts of other countries. The result was that a declaration was published about China, but it was extremely tepid, merely saying that China needed to stop prevaricating and take sides, a kind of comment that the Chinese will just shrug their shoulders over. And importantly and interestingly, there were no further really substantive sanctions on Russia published. There was no decision, for example, to impose an energy embargo on Russia. Instead, we got some claims that the European Union is entering into some kind of long, deep understanding with the United States to import more liquefied natural gas from the United States. There was a meeting between President Biden and the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, in which this is all outlined and set out. Now, I think it's perhaps worth saying that Ursula von der Leyen has been one of the most hardline drivers within Europe of this confrontation with Russia. There never seems to be a moment when she doesn't seek some further massive action against Russia. And in that, undoubtedly, she reflects the attitude of the European bureaucracies, the European Union bureaucracy and the NATO bureaucracy, both of which are based in Brussels. But energy policy is not, strictly speaking, the EU's province. Energy policy in the EU is still largely determined by individual countries. And of course, on this issue, the most important one is Germany, though Italy and other countries are also involved. And the Germans have been rolling out all kinds of statements about how they intend to halve their dependence on Russia within the next 6 months, how they expect to be completely free of dependence on Russia in energy terms by 2024. And the German economics minister, the extremely inexperienced Green politician Robert Habeck, has been very busy on this. He did a trip a short while ago to Qatar, and over the course of which he announced that Germany had made a long-term commitment with Qatar for liquefied natural gas from Qatar. I said that this wasn't the case at the time, and as I said in my previous video, Qatar has all but confirmed that in recent statements. And my own sense is that Robert Habeck probably does believe most of what he's saying. He's inexperienced enough to think so. But I think that the practical people, the experts in the German economics ministry and the industry ministry and within the German business community are basically hunkering down, waiting for this storm to pass, because they understand that all of these proposals to rush out of energy dependence on Russia by 2024 are utopian. At least that's my hope, because the alternative would be, to be very clear, not necessarily a major gas or energy shortage in Europe. We can always scrabble together and find gas and oil from all sorts of other places, but certainly very much higher prices for energy in Europe, which the German business community, in fact the business communities in many European countries, might struggle to cope with, and which households might struggle to cope with also. So I think that they are at the moment unwilling to stand up to this wind of hysteria that is coming out of some Western capitals, and in particular Brussels. And so they're coming up with token comments about LNG and LNG supplies from the United States and from Qatar and all the rest, waiting and hoping for the day when all this passes. I'm not sure, by the way, that it will pass. And I should say also that, of course, there's always the other side, the people on the other side of the hill, the Russians, who I think have had it up to there with the Europeans, and who are probably going to look anyway to reduce their export trade with Europe on energy anyway, regardless of what the German business community or the Italian business community or the professional experts in the German economics ministry and elsewhere may think or choose. I think this has been an extraordinary moment for the Russians when they finally concluded that the hard work that's been done over 30, 40 years, longer actually, to build up some kind of mutually satisfactory economic relationship between Russia and Europe, that all that hard work was for nothing and has gone to waste. And even if things do settle down for a while, persisting with this relationship will eventually lead to yet another crisis and another wave of hysteria, and that the Russians have basically had enough of that, and that they're already now thinking seriously about reorienting their energy exports and their food and raw material exports to their Asian partners, China and India. So that is what I think. I'm going to just finish by saying that I'm also starting to wonder whether Putin's ruble for gas demand or direction to Gazprom wasn't partly intended as a shot across the bows of the Europeans, a warning that if the Europeans do decide to rush ahead and cut off Russia from Russian oil supplies, that the Russians would retaliate by demanding rubles for their gas, in effect cutting off gas supplies to Europe also. With the Europeans apparently having pulled back, we will see whether the Russians persist with that idea. Anyway, these are just thoughts. We'll see what happens. We're still waiting for Gazprom to come back with its proposals to Putin's directives, and we'll see where this goes from this point forward. It's the military situation in Ukraine that I wish to discuss today. And here I should say that there's actually been more news from the ground. It seems that the Russians are now advancing further south from Izium, that they're gaining more and more places, settlements and places in Donbass. And also, as I discussed in my previous video yesterday, that the clear out of Mariupol is now coming towards its conclusion. But I haven't followed very closely the actual news from Donbass because and from Ukraine, because my focus was on that briefing given by Colonel General Rudskoy, the Chief of Operations of the Russian General Staff, yesterday. I touched on parts of it yesterday in my previous video, but I didn't at that point have access to the entirety of it, and therefore I didn't get a full sense of what he was saying. And Rudskoy's briefing is extremely interesting, and it puts everything in context. I'm going to say in advance that I think it fully corroborates the analysis that Alex Christoforou and I have been making on the Duran, and also, by the way, the analysis that some other people have also been making as well. People like the Moon of Alabama, for example, but also others. And obviously it completely contradicts the Western discussions of the conflict, which, as I have repeatedly said, show a profound misunderstanding of the way in which the Russians conduct war, and in specifically of the way that the Russians are conducting this war. Having said that, I think the best thing to do is to press forward and discuss what General Rudskoy has to say. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense has provided the full text of his statement. It's fairly long, but since I know in many places it is extremely difficult to access information from the Russian Ministry of Defense, I'm going to read out his statement in full. It will take me some time to do that, for which I apologize, but also anyway, I know that some people like to listen to documents, and that's why I'm going to read what General Rudskoy had to say. So these are General Rudskoy's words. In accordance with the decision of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, that's of course Putin, since February 24th this year, the armed forces of the Russian Federation are conducting a special military operation. Its main goal is to provide assistance to the people of the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics who have been subjected to genocide by the Kiev regime for 8 years. It was impossible to achieve this goal by political means. Kiev has publicly refused to implement the Minsk agreements. The Ukrainian leadership twice in 2014 and 2015 tried to solve the so-called Donbass problem by military means, was defeated, but did not change its plans on resolving conflict by force in the east of the country. According to reliable data, the armed forces of Ukraine were completing the preparation of a military operation to take control of the territory of the People's Republics. In these conditions, it was possible to help the Donetsk and Lugansk republics only by providing them with military assistance, which Russia has done. There were two possible courses of action. The first is to limit the territory to only the DPR and LPR within the administrative borders of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, which is enshrined in the constitutions of the republics. But we would be faced with constant feeding by Ukrainian authorities of the grouping involved in the so-called joint force operation. Joint force operation, by the way, is what the Ukrainians call their military grouping in eastern Ukraine their military grouping in Donbass. To return to General Rudskoy's comments, therefore the second option was chosen, which provides for actions throughout the territory of Ukraine with the implementation of measures for its demilitarization and denazification. The course of the operation confirmed the validity of the decision. Now, in my video yesterday, I explained that contrary to what you've been reading in some places in the Western media, what Rudskoy has just said, that the Russians considered two alternatives. One was to confine their military actions to Donbass. The second was to go beyond Donbass, because confining military operations to Donbass would simply have moved the line of conflict just a few miles further west and would have perpetuated the war, whereas what the Russians are seeking is a total and comprehensive solution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass. What Rudskoy said here is not a departure from what the Russians have said before. If you go back to Putin's comments all the way to the start of the operation in February, it is completely consistent with it. And Putin himself, in his comments to airline staff, which I discussed in my video yesterday, which comments he made on 5th March 2022, basically said exactly the same thing about the two options that the political leadership in Moscow was given by the General Staff, and that it was the political leadership, after hearing from the General Staff, that decided that the only way to resolve this conflict fully, comprehensively and totally was to go beyond Donbass. So I just want to repeat this again, because this story that there's been a scaling down of Russian intentions is, in my opinion, completely wrong and pays no heed to what the Russians said previously. But anyway, I will now continue with General Rudskoy's comments. The operation is conducted by the General Staff in accordance with the approved plan. The tasks are carried out taking into account minimizing losses amongst personnel and minimizing damage to civilians. With the beginning of a special military operation, air supremacy was won during the first 2 days. Now, before I proceed at this point, I should say, yet again, that though I am not in any way any kind of military expert, and certainly not an expert on Russian military tactics and operations and strategy, I have been aware for some time that the Russians make a distinction between what the Western powers call air superiority and what the Russians call air supremacy. The Western concept of air superiority is basically one in which the enemy air force is completely cleared from the skies. It's no longer able to operate at all. It's not even able to launch any single aircraft. And generally, in Western wars, such as the war that was fought, for example, against Iraq, first in 1991 and then in 2003, those wars, the ground operations, only tend to be launched after total air superiority has been achieved, and that means the total and complete destruction of the enemy's air force. The Russians don't work like that. They pursue something else, which is called air supremacy. It isn't necessary for them to take action to completely sweep the enemy's air force from the skies. They are prepared to engage the enemy in ground operations when they dominate the skies. That is to say, the enemy may still have an air force. He may still be able to send aircraft up from time to time. He may still even be able to shoot down some of your aircraft. But the point is that you have air supremacy, you have dominance over the skies, over the enemy's armies and even country, And that means that you can both support your ground forces and protect them from aerial attack. And the reason the Russians do that is because they prefer, in the initial stages of a campaign, a faster tempo of operations, and also they don't want to give the enemy time to prepare on the ground to meet whatever offensive they may be intending to launch. And a good example of the kind of situation that the Russians want to avoid was provided by the Yugoslav War of 1999. After 78 days of bombing, the NATO Air Force was unable to achieve air superiority over the Yugoslav army in Kosovo or elsewhere. And that delayed the ground operation against the Yugoslav forces in Kosovo to the point where those forces were beginning to hunker down and establish themselves in positions where they might have been able, in the event of a ground war, to inflict very heavy casualties on any NATO forces, with the result that that conflict had to be ended through diplomatic action. Well, the Russians don't want to be put in that position. They don't want to give the opportunity to the enemy to arrange themselves in defensive positions, to prepare themselves for the main axes, to meet the main axes of the advance. And so they are willing to engage in ground operations as soon as what they call air supremacy, which is to say aerial dominance, as opposed to air superiority, has been achieved. Anyway, that's just a little lecture. That was all explained to me, by the way, decades ago. And here we see General Rudskoy talking about it again. So then, to proceed with what he says, offensive actions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation are carried out in various directions. As a result, Russian troops blocked Kiev, Kharkiv, Chernigov, Sumy, and Nikolaev. Kherson and most of the Zaporozhye region are under full control. The public and individual experts are wondering what we are doing in the area of blocked Ukrainian cities. These actions are carried out with the aim of causing such damage to military infrastructure, equipment, personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine, the results of which allow not only to shackle their forces and do not give them the opportunity to strengthen their grouping in Donbass, but also will not allow them to do so until the Russian army completely liberates the territories of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Now, this is exactly the point that we've been making, Alex Christoforou and I, on our respective channels, and of course on the Duran, that the deployment of Russian forces around these cities, Kiev, Kharkov, Chernigov, Sumy, Nikolaev, is not intended at the moment to storm these cities. It is intended instead to pin down Ukrainian forces into positions where they feel obliged to defend the cities and cannot therefore concentrate their forces in Donbass to reinforce the Ukrainian army there, which is the prime target and object of the Russian offensive. So that's what this whole operation is all about. It's not about storming cities. It's not about capturing territory. It is about fragmenting the Ukrainian army, forcing it to defend cities in all sorts of places around Ukraine, so that the major grouping of the Ukrainian army in Donbass is isolated and the various parts of the Ukrainian military can be defeated one by one in detail. To continue, therefore, with what General Rudskoy had to say. Initially, we did not plan to storm these cities in order to prevent destruction and minimize losses among personnel and civilians. And although we do not rule out such a possibility, however, as individual groups complete their tasks and they are being solved successfully, our forces and means will concentrate on the main thing, the complete liberation of Donbass. Now, again, this isn't a retreat of strategic priorities to Donbass. It's an explanation of what the Russians are doing and have been doing in this conflict all along, as Alex Christoforou and myself and others like Scott Ritter, Colonel McGregor, people like that, have been saying all along. The focus is on the destruction of the enemy's main force, his army in Donbass, and the liberation of the Donbass region, whose independence the Russians have now recognized. And the further point, which is the point that I made in my program yesterday, is that Rutskoy is now saying that the possibility that one day the Russians might storm these cities, Kharkiv, Chernigov, Kiev even, possibly Nikolaev, is not ruled out. And that, I think, is intended as a warning to the Ukrainians that if they persist with this war, then eventually, once the Donbass has been completely cleared of Ukrainian troops, once the main grouping, the best grouping of the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine has been destroyed, then at that point the Russians are prepared to go further. And if Ukraine is not prepared to sign peace, then it must start to expect that some of its cities will be stormed by the Russians as they press home their military advantage and press home either to achieve peace or, if peace cannot be achieved, the complete dismantling of the existing political and state structures in Ukraine through the capture of Ukrainian cities and territory. So, at the moment, the Russians have no plan to storm Kiev or Kharkiv or Chernigov or Sumy or Nikolaev, but that may change. And that's something that the Ukrainians and the Western powers need to understand. Now, I would say that earlier today, just before I did this program, I actually learned that a significant force of Ukrainian troops have actually withdrawn from a Ukrainian city which has been encircled by the Russians in Kiev region. And apparently the Russians agreed to this withdrawal and have not so far entered the city, but perhaps that's a sign of things to come. And yesterday there were further reports that the Russians have now completed and completely blocked all exits from the other important Ukrainian city of Chernigov. So it may be that as the situation in Donbass heads towards a conclusion, that the Russians are already preparing the ground to make further advances in other Ukrainian cities. And of course, I should say that if Russian-speaking cities like Kharkiv and Chernigov are taken over by the Russians, then it's far from clear to me, or far from certain, that the Russians will ever leave. But anyway, to continue with what General Rutskoy had to say. Significant territories of the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics have also been liberated. The People's Militia has taken control of 276 settlements that were previously under the control of the Ukrainian army and the national battalions. Demilitarization of Ukraine is achieved both by high-precision strikes on military infrastructure facilities, locations of formations and military units, airfields, control points, arsenals and warehouses of weapons and military equipment, and by the actions of troops to defeat opposing enemy groupings. Currently, the Ukrainian air forces and the air defense system have been almost completely destroyed. The naval forces of the country have ceased to exist. 16 main military airfields were defeated, from which combat sorties of the Ukrainian Air Force were carried out. 39 storage bases and arsenals were destroyed, which contained up to 70% of all stocks of military equipment, material and fuel, as more than 1,054,000 tons of ammunition. I should say that I think some of the translation of some of these figures is shaky, and I'm not going to vouch for its complete accuracy. Maybe the General Rutskoy isn't himself sure, but this looks to me like a machine translation, and we're getting some rather odd figures here. But the fact remains that even the Ukrainians themselves have recently been saying that that their forces are running out of supplies, and we see that General Rutskoy is essentially confirming this. Anyway, then to continue with what General Rutskoy had to say. All 24 formations of the land forces, the Ukrainian land forces that existed before the start of the operation, have suffered significant losses. Ukraine has no organized reserves left. So it can't reinforce its increasingly depleted forces with properly organized military formations or with properly trained troops. And this is what he went on to say. Losses are replenished at the expense of mobilized persons, that's to say reservists, and personnel of the territorial defense force. This is a militia that was conjured up by the Ukrainians right at the start of the war, when, in my opinion, very irresponsibly, they handed out light weapons to large parts of the civilian population, causing severe problems of law and order in some Ukrainian cities. But then he goes on to say, General Rutskoy says that these mobilized persons and personnel of the territorial defense do not have the necessary training, which increases the risk of large losses. At the time of the start of the special military operation, the armed forces of Ukraine, together with the National Guard, numbered 260,200 servicemen. Again, I think there's some problems with some of the numbers here, some of the translations of the numbers. But if this is correct, and we're talking about 260,000 troops in the Ukrainian army and the National Guard at the start of the conflict, then that number, by the way, outnumbers every calculation I have seen of the total number of Russian troops deployed in Ukraine since the start of the war. And it would outnumber those Russian troops, even if one added to them the Donbass militia, the forces of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and the Chechen forces as well. So I think that's perhaps something to bear in mind. The Russians clearly feel that they have a substantial qualitative edge, but at the beginning of this war, Ukraine actually, according to the Russians, had the greater manpower. And that perhaps explains why the Russians have been anxious to disperse Ukrainian troops, to keep them dispersed by isolating them, defending places like Kiev, Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Nikolaev, and the rest, rather than have the greater part of these forces, which outnumber the Russian forces, located, concentrated in Donbass. Anyway, to continue, of the 2,400, during the month of hostilities, this is Rutskoy again. During the months of hostilities, Ukrainian losses have amounted to about 30,000 people. including about more than 14,000 irretrievable and about 16,000 sanitary. Now, as I said, this is a machine translation, and I'm not entirely clear what 14,000 irretrievable and 16,000 sanitary exactly means. I think 16,000 sanitary probably means wounded. 14,000, I presume, means either killed in action or taken prisoner. So, again, I can't vouch for these figures, but these are General Rutskoi's figures. They could be exaggerated. As I said in my previous program, in my experience in war, armies, countries are reasonably reliable in reporting their own casualties, but are very unreliable in reporting their enemies. So it could be that these figures are inflated. I've no way of knowing one way or the other. But if 14,000, the 14,000 that this translation says are irretrievable, means both killed and captured, then I'm going to make a guess that it's probably about right. Anyway, to continue, again, what General Rutskoi said. Of the 2,416 tanks and other armoured vehicles that Ukraine had in combat on February 24th, 1,587 have been destroyed. Again, I can't obviously confirm this, and one is a bit suspicious about the extreme precision of these figures, but I suspect it's probably about right, and it would mean that the Russians have destroyed around 2/3 of Ukraine's armoured forces, and Ukraine is not able to replace them because Western military aid, as we will discuss shortly, does not take the form of replacements of tanks and armoured vehicles which have been destroyed. Anyway, to continue with what he says, what Rutskoi says, 636 units out of 1,509 field guns and artillery and mortars. So that's about just over a third of those forces, around 40% of Ukraine's artillery has been destroyed. 163 out of 535 of Ukraine's multiple rocket launcher systems. Now, that's between a quarter and a third by my rather bad back of the envelope calculations. 112 out of 152 aircraft. So we see that most of the Ukrainian Air Force has been destroyed. 75 out of 149 helicopters. That's presumably that's about half of the Ukrainian helicopter force. Now, I should say that over the last couple of days, there's been various reports in the Western media about the Russians withdrawing their helicopters from Kherson airport, which was supposedly the target of a Ukraine missile strike. That may or may not be true, but Russian reports that I've read actually say that the helicopters that were removed from Kherson airport were not Russian at all, but were captured Ukrainian helicopters. Since Ukraine uses helicopters left over from the Soviet era, which are difficult to distinguish from Russian helicopters, it's difficult to say one way or the other. But anyway, General Rutskoi says that Ukraine has lost half of its helicopters, more than half of its helicopters. And then he says that they've also lost 36 Bayraktar TB2 drones. And then we have a rather odd figure. He says UAV 35, which I don't understand what that means. What exactly that means? On the face of it, it looks as if Ukraine has seen the loss of more Bayraktar drones, 36 of them, than the Russians believed it possessed, which was 35. By the way, if that may very well be true. It's absolutely clear to me that despite protestations from Turkey, Ukraine has received far more Turkish Bayraktar drones than had previously been admitted. Before the start of the war, I had been led to believe, as I think most people had believed, and open sources were saying, that Ukraine had received around a dozen of these Turkish Bayraktar drones. Well, Rutskoy says that the Russians have already destroyed 3 times that number. So Erdogan's military help to Ukraine was on a far, far bigger scale than he or Turkey ever admitted to. And I wonder whether this was perhaps something that Erdogan quietly agreed with NATO and with the authorities in Washington as part of his effort perhaps to try to maintain this balance, this complicated balance between the Russians and the Americans that he was always working towards, that he was secretly providing the Ukrainians with far more of these Turkish drones than he was publicly acknowledging. And of course, these drones are offensive weapons, and there were articles in the Atlantic Council website, the Atlantic Council being, of course, a think tank very closely connected to NATO. There were articles in the Atlantic Council website in the autumn of 2020 and in the winter and spring of 2021 about how these Turkish drones, these Bayraktar drones, would be a game changer and would be essential and would enable the Ukrainian military to roll over the militia in the Donbass in the way that the Azerbaijani army had been able to defeat the Armenian forces in the Caucasus in the course of the war there in 2020. Anyway, to continue, we then have more rather odd figures from the Russian Ministry of Defense, because the next sentence gives the impression that Rutskoy thinks that the Russians have destroyed 180 out of 148 Ukrainian S-300 and Buk M1 air defense systems. So that would imply that the Russians have destroyed more air defense systems, more Ukraine air defense systems than they believed that the Ukrainians had, and 300 out of 117 radars for various purposes. I wonder whether here there's either been a mistake in machine translations or whether again the Russians underestimated the number of S-300s and radars that the Ukrainians had at the outset of the conflict, and that perhaps they didn't realize the extent to which S-300s and radars were being covertly supplied to Ukraine from East European members of NATO, and that the Russians therefore are finding that they're destroying more of these than they realize that the Ukrainians actually possessed. Well, I don't know. I can't guess. Maybe instead it's just a machine mistranslation here. But anyway, to continue. This is again from General Rutskoy. The Ukrainian armed forces continue to use high-powered weapons indiscriminately against towns in Donbass. An example of this is the strikes by the Tochka-U missile system on the civilian population of Donetsk and Makeyevka. In this regard, the Tochka-U launchers are primary targets. As of today, 7 Tochka-U launchers have been destroyed, and 85% of missiles have been destroyed in their arsenals and in the air. This significantly limits Ukraine's capability for their combat use. Since the beginning of hostilities, the Western countries have supplied the Kiev regime with 109 field guns, 3,800 anti-tank weapons, including Javelin, Milan, Konkurz. Konkurz is a Soviet system, by the way. And Law, 80 anti-tank guided missiles, M72s, Panzerfaust 3s. They've also supplied Ukraine with 897 Stinger and Igla manpads. The Igla system is also a Soviet system. Note how precise General Rutskoy's figures are. One wonders how he's able to give such precise numbers of the weapon systems that the NATO powers have sent to Ukraine since the start of hostilities. Anyway, he then goes on to say, we consider it a vast mistake for Western countries to supply weapons to Kiev. This delays the conflict, increases the number of victims, and will not be able to influence the outcome of the operation. So all these weapon systems that are being sent to Ukraine are not changing the outcome of the war, but it might prolong it, and it will mean that more people will die. I'm sure he's right. Anyway, Rutskoy then goes on to say the real purpose of such supplies is not to support Ukraine, but to drag it into a long-term conflict to the last Ukrainian. Now, this, I'm going to say straight away, it comes from a Russian general, but I would remind everybody of my own view here, which is that given that the outcome of this operation is not in doubt, and given the enormous damage Ukraine is suffering, the priority for Ukraine, for the Ukrainian government, is not to prolong this war, but to achieve peace. And Rutskoy essentially is saying the same thing. It's a Russian general, so perhaps he would say that, but for what it's worth, it's also my opinion also. I do not see the purpose, the political logic or the military logic for Ukraine in sacrificing its people in a hopeless cause. Anyway, to continue with what General Rutskoy has to say. We are closely monitoring the statements of the military and political leadership of individual countries about their intention to supply aircraft and air defense systems to Ukraine. In case of implementation, we will not leave it without attention. We also hear assurances from NATO leaders about non-interference in the conflict. At the same time, some member states of the North Atlantic Alliance propose to close the airspace over Ukraine. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the armed forces of the Russian Federation will immediately respond accordingly to such attempts. So this is a clear warning from the Russians. If there's any attempt to interfere in this conflict, if Western forces are deployed in Ukraine, if there's any attempt to operate a no-fly zone in Ukraine, the Russian military will react. Now, I'm sure that's right, and one of the fascinating things about the NATO summit that's just happened and about President Biden's visit to Poland is that there is no sign yet, despite an extraordinarily muddled and chaotic speech that President Biden made to the troops of the 82nd Airborne Division in Poland. There's no sign at all that NATO is in fact prepared to do any of these disastrous steps, like send troops into Ukraine, impose no-fly zones, or do anything like that. And that idea of a Polish peacekeeping force, all of that seems to have ended. There doesn't seem to be any plan for it, at least not for the moment. Anyway, to continue General Rutskoy's comments, in order to prevent the restoration of weapons and military equipment of the Ukrainian armed forces that have received combat damage, the Russian armed forces are disabling repair facilities, arsenals, storage bases, logistics warehouses with high-precision weapons. At the moment, 30 key enterprises of the Ukrainian military industrial complex have been hit by cruise missiles, Kh-101s, Kalibr, Iskander and Kinjal, which carry out repairs of 68% of the weapons and equipment disabled during combat operations. Russian modern weaponry has proved to be highly reliable, accurate, and capable of operational use. I would like to emphasize that the armed forces of the Russian Federation do not strike at civilian infrastructure facilities, including the destruction of bridges across rivers. 127 bridges have been destroyed in the area of military operations. All of them have been blown up by Ukrainian nationalists in order to deter the advance of our troops. Another example of recklessness is the mining of approaches to the ports of Odessa, Ochakov, Chernomorsk, and Yuzhny, where over 400 obsolete anchor mines have been installed. At least 10 mines have broken anchor and are drifting in the western part of the Black Sea, which poses a real threat to warships and civilian vessels. Now, I should say that there's been some discussion in some places about whether the Ukrainian troops in eastern Ukraine are surrounded or not, whether they are in a cauldron or not. In Mariupol, of course, they are. In the area of Severodonetsk, as we will see, they also are. The main grouping in Donetsk, to a great extent, is also because it cannot get resupplied, and of course it can probably retreat, but the Russians have always said that they would allow Ukrainian troops to retreat from their cauldrons if they lay down arms. As I have repeatedly said, we must not make the mistake of thinking of cauldrons as medieval sieges, where every single place is guarded by some kind of soldier. That might be true in Mariupol, but it is not true of the effective cauldron in the Donbass. What it means is that Ukrainian troops have had their supplies blocked, their supplies of weapon systems and ammunition, and as we will shortly see, of fuel as well. Anyway, to continue with what General Rudskoy has to say. The rampant crime, looting and marauding and civilian deaths have been caused by the Ukrainian government's massive uncontrolled distribution of tens of thousands of small arms to the civilian population, including to criminals released from prisons. The situation will only get worse in future. I have to say here that I've had that confirmed to me from reports of people on the ground in Ukraine, and of course Gonzalo Lira, who participates in our programs on the Duran, has said the same thing in our live streams. The course of hostilities, the testimonies of civilians left in the blockaded settlements and captured Ukrainian servicemen show today that the Ukrainian armed forces' ability to resist is based on fear of reprisals. Well, I take that with a giant pinch of salt. But anyway, that's what General Rudskoy said. The representatives of far-right formations are embedded in all military units. Well, that's Rudskoy's comments. I'm not going to take that further. I can't corroborate it. That could be propaganda. But it might, for all I know, also be true. The mainstay of the Kiev regime are nationalist formations such as Azov, Aidar, Right Sector and others recognized in Russia as terrorist organizations. In Mariupol alone, they include more than 7,000 militants who are fighting under the guise of civilians, using them as a human shield. Well, that may or may not be true. I'm not going to get into discussions. And then General Rudskoy says that the militants of the Azov battalion drive women and children out of basements, threatening them with weapons and sending them towards the advancing units of the People's Militia of the Donbass People's Republic in order to hinder the advance of the militia. This has become a common practice for them. This may be true. It may just be overheated rhetoric. I can't corroborate any part of this. Anyway, Rudskoy then goes on to say The armed forces of the Russian Federation, on the contrary, seek to avoid unnecessary deaths. Before the start of the offensive, the units of the armed forces of Ukraine were invited to leave the combat area and move along with equipment and weapons to their points of permanent deployment, not to resist when the offensive begins, and those who lay down their arms are guaranteed safety. Civilians caught in a war zone are always advised to stay in their homes. Humanitarian corridors are being organized in all cities to get the population out of the area of hostilities, and their security is also maintained. As I've said before, this is very much the practice that the Russians have followed in Syria: surround cities, create humanitarian corridors, invite the civilian population to leave, ultimately try to persuade the Ukrainian, the military, the opposing military, in this case the Ukrainian military, to evacuate from these cities also. And in this town, I'm not quite sure of its name, in Kiev region, which I was talking about earlier in this program, which has now been surrounded and where the Ukrainian forces have apparently been withdrawn, this also has apparently happened. Anyway, to continue with General Rudskoy's comment, in addition, at the initiative of the Ukrainian leadership, the country has become a home to 6,595 foreign mercenaries and terrorists from 62 states. Again, interesting that he has such precise numbers. I wonder where they come from. They are not subject to the rules of war and will be ruthlessly destroyed. Today, the number of foreign mercenaries is declining. This was facilitated by high-precision strikes on their bases and training camps. On March 13th, more than 200 were killed and more than 400 wounded in missiles as a result of missile strikes in Starichi and at the Yavorovsky training ground alone. I note that not a single foreign mercenary has arrived in Ukraine in the last 7 days. On the contrary, there has been an outflow. Within a week, 285 fighters escaped into Poland, Hungary and Romania. I hope without stingers and javelins. Again, I wonder where General Rudskoy gets these numbers. Are they real? Are they invented out of the whole cloth? Or does he have extremely precise intelligence? I'm not going to try and guess. Previous experience has shown that man-portable air defense systems and anti-tank guided missiles are spreading out fairly quickly along with mercenaries who return home. That is absolutely true, and it's a serious concern. And I would say that this flooding of Ukraine with Stinger missiles, javelins and other anti-tank weapons like this kind seems to me to have been extremely reckless and even irresponsible. But anyway, there we go. And then he summarized it up like this. In general, the main objectives of the first phase of the Russian operation have been achieved. The combat capabilities of Ukraine's armed forces have been significantly reduced, which allows us once again to concentrate our main efforts on achieving the main goal, the liberation of Donbass. In 8 years, in the area of the so-called Joint Forces operation, a defense belt has been prepared that is deeply echeloned and well fortified in engineering terms, consisting of a system of monolithic, long-term concrete structures. In this regard, in order to minimize casualties among the armed forces of the Russian Federation, Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics, the conduct of operations is preceded by heavy fire attack on the enemy's strongholds and their reserves. At the beginning of the special military operation, the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Militia were confronted by a grouping of 59,300 people comprising the most combat-ready units of the Ukrainian armed forces, the National Guard and national formations. So that's a figure for the forces that Ukraine had deployed in Donbass. 59,300, 60,000. Now that's out of a total armed forces that General Rutskoy, total Ukrainian armed forces, which General Rutskoy said numbered 260,000. But he goes on to say that these are the best forces that Ukraine has. And he then says, as a result, Ukraine's forces in the battle zone have lost about 16,000 people, or 26% of their total strength, as of 24th February this year. Now, this is a massively high casualty rate, if it's true. Again, I can't corroborate it, but it may be true, given that 14,500 of these troops, these 60,000 troops, were apparently stationed in Mariupol, which has been completely surrounded, and where the forces there are being destroyed. And then he goes on to say more than 7,000 of these losses are irrecoverable losses. Again, that doesn't seem to suggest that they've all been killed. It could be that a lot of them have been taken prisoner. And then he goes on to say replacing losses is prevented by isolating the Ukrainian grouping in Donbass, taking control of railway stations and key routes with firepower. So he's in effect saying that these troops are bottled up in Donbass. They cannot get resupplied, they cannot get reinforced, and they cannot get resupplied because the Russians are able to dominate with firepower all the access points. And he goes on to say the supply of missiles and ammunition, fuel and food to the Ukrainian forces has been almost completely halted. The field depots of missile and artillery weapon systems and ammunition, as well as fuel located directly in the area of the Joint Forces operation, are being hit. To date, 32 facilities have been destroyed, or 61% of the total. All weapons and military equipment, including foreign-made, seized by the armed forces of the Russian Federation during the special military operation, have been handed over to the People's Republics. Already 113 tanks and other armoured vehicles, 138 Javelin and 67 Law grenade launchers and other trophy weapons have been handed over. Units of the People's Militia of the Lugansk People's Republic have liberated 93% of their republic's territory. Fighting is currently taking place on the outskirts of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. The People's Militia of the Donetsk People's Republic controls 54% of its territory. The liberation of Mariupol continues. Units of the Russian armed forces, together with the People's Militia of the Donetsk People's Republic, are conducting an offensive to liberate settlements to the west of Donetsk. Unfortunately, there are casualties amongst our comrades in arms during the special military operation. As of today, 1,351 servicemen have been killed and 3,825 have been wounded. As I've said in my previous program, I think these are correct figures, and I would say that some people have said that these relate to figures of the Russian armed forces exclusively and don't include the People's Militia. But I would say that General Rutskoy doesn't actually say that one way or the other. Anyway, he then goes on to say all family support solutions will be taken by the state, raising children up to higher education, full repayment of loans, housing solutions. We receive a large number of appeals from Russian citizens wishing to take part in the special military operation. In addition, more than 23,000 foreigners from 37 countries have expressed their willingness to fight on the side of the People's Republics. We offered the leadership of the People's Republics to accept this assistance, but they said they would defend their land by themselves. They have enough power and resources to do so. The armed forces of the Russian Federation will continue to conduct a planned special military operation until the tasks set by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, that's to say Putin, have been completed. So there we are. That basically is a Russian account of the operation up to now. As I said, it corroborates Alex Christoforou and my account of the war. The Russians have made their main focus of operation the destruction of Ukrainian forces in Donbass. Those forces have been isolated from the rest of the Ukrainian army, which has been divided up into penny packets, defending Ukrainian cities, even as the major force of the Ukrainian army, its most capable forces, is being systematically destroyed. Some people have pointed out that this is a war of attrition, and in a sense it is. But it is a war of attrition which the Russians have chosen to fight as a war of attrition, and which the Russians are winning. When people talk about a war of attrition, they should ask themselves, who is suffering the attrition? According to General Rudskoy's account, and according to every account from the war zone, which I consider reliable, it is the Ukrainians. It is the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine that is being systematically destroyed with horrendous losses in lives and material, and all, so far as I can see, to no cause. Well, this is a long program. I apologize for this. I had to, as I said, cover this rather complicated discussion, briefing by General Rudskoy, which I, by the way, consider to be, for all the undoubted propagandistic elements which it contains, probably the most detailed and ultimately reliable discussion of the conflict. And of course, it comes from an authoritative source. So I hope you've learned something from this long program. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel. I've obviously appearing on multiple platforms. I talked about our I talked at the start about Rumble and Locals, but of course we're on other platforms too. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. And if you've liked this video, remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I hope you've learned something from this video, and I look forward to you joining me again soon.